Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this, our third panel of the day. Again, the title is 50 Years Later, Blacks in the 21st Century. The panel is framed around what kind of progress Blacks have made since the Civil Rights Movement and the enduring challenges and inequality that face African Americans in the 21st century. The organizers have formulated two major questions for us to talk about. The first is what historical and contemporary factors continue to make racial equality a contested and elusive concept in the 21st century? And second, what kinds of knowledge can we mobilize to face the specific challenges of racial inequity in our contemporary moment? I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to be in conversation with two and possibly three speakers, dynamic speakers and dynamic thinkers today. And I'd like to introduce you to them before opening our conversation. Joining us is Farah Griffin, who is the William B. Ransford Professor of English Comparative Literature and African American Studies at Columbia. And she has also served as the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. Her most recent book is forthcoming in September, Harlem, Nocturne, Women Artists and Progressive Politics during World War II. Pardon me. Our second panelist is Peniel Joseph, who is founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy and professor of history at Tufts University, and the author of the award-winning Wait Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, and Dark Days, Bright Nights from Black Power to Barack Obama. Our third scheduled speaker is Kendall Thomas, who is traveling in from Brazil, and unfortunately he has not yet arrived, but we're hoping that he will take the stage as soon as he does come. I'm going to introduce him in his absence right now. Kendall is Nash Professor of Law and co-founder and director of the Center for the Study of Law and Culture at Columbia University. And Professor Thomas is one of the editors of the seminal volume, Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings That Formed the Movement. So we have three powerful thinkers and powerful visionary speakers. Oh, hooray. Welcome, Kendall. Get settled, make yourself comfortable, and we're so glad you made it. I was saying to both Peniel and to Farah before we came on that in so many ways, Barack Obama has set up our conversation about blacks in the 21st century through his comments yesterday. But I want to put that into a larger context because we're trying to take a backward and a forward look on this panel in our conversation. The backward look is about where have we come to since in the 50 years since the March on Washington, right? At the same time, this particular moment is framed by three undeniable events. The first is that in the 3.5 weeks ago, actually, the Supreme Court overturned the Domestic Marriage Act and struck down the Voting Rights Act. At the same time, 7 days ago, George Zimmerman was acquitted of the murder of Trayvon Martin, right? And yesterday, the first African-American president of the United States, Barack Obama, made his second public statement on the state of race relations in the United States. So this is a really key moment to reflect on 50 years later, and what kind of progress have we made in Black America. So to start out with, I'm going to ask you each to comment on what you see as the impact of these three events on Black political culture, and what they say about what kind of progress is or is not being made in the 21st century. Farah, do you want to open up?
Sure. Thank you, Tina. Thank you all for being here. That's a very provocative question. It's difficult to come up with quick answers in the heat of this particular moment, but I'll try to address it. I think that those three, and they're all three legal interventions, so to speak, at this moment, tell us the importance of understanding what racial progress has meant historically. Progress, the historical nature of what we call progress in the area of race equality is always characterized by a movement forward and retrenchment. So that there is never any straight sense of progress. We can look and say that we certainly have made great strides since the 1963 March on Washington. And one of the key things that we accomplished following that march was the Voting Rights Act 2 years later. And yet here 50 years later, we have a retrenchment on that key piece of legislation. 50 years later, we have something that many of us know to be an act of racial violence, where the person has been found not guilty. And yet I think the difference is 50 years ago, we might not have been attacked for calling it an act of racial violence, right? And that shows you the way the kind of retrenchment works, that it becomes more sophisticated. It makes it more difficult for us to name things that we know have to do with race. And those of us who call it an act of racial violence are then accused of being divisive. I don't think that would have been the case 50 years ago. So there's progress, but there's always retrenchment, backlash, one step forward, and maybe 2 or 3 or 4 steps backward. And we have to be aware of that. And I think these acts show that, show us that. DOMA is a step forward. The striking down of the Voting Rights Act is certainly a step backward. And Trayvon Martin, I think, is both, because it's a step backward, but the mobilization, I'm so heartened by the mobilization around it, and the refusal to give in to the kind of dominant narratives that were spun as a result of it. So progress and retrenchment.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, Max, for organizing this panel. I think we owe Max Rodriguez a big round of applause for the 15th anniversary of the Harlem Book Fair. This book fair is part of a national conversation about race and democracy that we should be having in our communities everywhere around the country, that should be multicultural, multiracial, multi-generational. And we've been having these conversations in our communities historically throughout, but we need to have these conversations among white Americans, among Latinos, among gays and lesbians, among young people, and it's really, it should be a national priority. First of all, I'd like to throw out a provocation. I'd like to throw out a provocation that the difference between 1963 and 2013 is that in 1963, black people knew they were being oppressed. In 1963, they knew that they were being politically, socially, economically subjugated. I'd like to throw out a provocation that when we think about the heroic period of the civil rights movement between 1954 and 1965, what black people did then is transform fundamentally American democracy, and they did so with white allies, with Latino allies, but they did so through blood and bloodshed. When we think about Trayvon Martin has antecedents in Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black boy who was assassinated in Money, Mississippi in 1955 for allegedly violating racial etiquette and speaking to a white woman. Till's body was placed in the Tallahatchie River with a 125-pound cotton gin fan belt tied around his neck. It was shown in Jet magazine, and that spurred the nation to look at the price of white supremacy on our democracy. When we think about 1963 is the year of Birmingham, and the year that Dr. King writes his very, very famous letter from a Birmingham jail. And in that letter, Dr. King says that the activism that's going on in Birmingham and the young women and men who are being arrested, sometimes as young as 8, 9, and 10 years old, are taking this nation back to those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the founding fathers. Now, King was being too kind because this country is founded on racial slavery. It's a conversation that we still have not had. But 50 years ago, what the March on Washington provided was a litmus test for American democracy. When King speaks at the March on Washington Wednesday, August 28, 1963, he says that Americans of all colors and all races are going to have to struggle together, they're going to have to go to jail together to try to fundamentally transform American democracy. 50 years later, and especially in the aftermath of Barack Obama's 2008 election, we've all celebrated an unearned victory. We've all celebrated an unearned victory and talked about post-racial America. We're celebrating the